here so they're not wrapped up in this roll. Yeah, that's a really lurid one, huh?
I'm Jonathan. This is my friend Jed Chevalier, who's a watch, maven, expert dealer, watch safari.
Watch Safari, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
And I like watches, and I have a few of them. I thought we'd talk about watches and stuff today, maybe like watches and audio.
Absolutely.
Because
I love
both
of these things.
The reason, you're here is, you own Fleetwood DeVilles.
I own Fleetwood DeVilles.
And you own old vintage Cadillacs.
Vintage Cadillacs. I have a Fleetwood and a DeVille.
You have
Cadillac.
a DeVille?
Yeah, both.
Wait, what year?
70.
Yeah, the Fleetwood I've seen.
The Fleetwood's a 95. The DeVille is the 70.
1970. So he owns both a Cadillac Fleetwood DeVille and a Fleetwood Sound Company DeVille loudspeaker. And he knows more about he's forgotten more about watches than I will ever know.
That's really nice of you to say, Jonathan.
And you brought some of your own watches here.
I did. I'm a watch dealer, as a lot of people know, and basically, I go around looking for great watches, making friends with people that are into watches, selling watches, that kind of thing. But over the years, there are watches that I put away personally that there was some connection that I thought were cool.
These are not for sale. These are yours.
These are my personal watches, which many people don't see because I usually just bring watches
and you
up
don't
that I'm
want
trying
them
to
to
sell.
see it because you don't want them knowing what the good stuff is, right?
Well, not even that. It's just like if I have decided to collect a watch, I don't want to confuse it with a watch that I'm trying to sell.
Right.
To me, then again, the watches that I collect make a big impact on the kinds of watches that I try to get other people interested in. And I do sell watches like this to other people as well. These are just my personal ones.
Right. Now, one of the things that I noticed about you from the very beginning is that you look at everything from an aesthetic point of view first, and you really seem to look at these things like I do, like little sculptures as well as little machines.
It's all about art. It's about a combination of art and functionality, but one of my least favorite sayings is that form follows function. I think something should be beautiful before it's functional.
Yeah.
It has to be beautiful, or otherwise I'm not going to consider the functionality.
But it's also a bit of it's a misnomer, because in fact, when you really break things down that are supposedly designs that are form follows function, there's many different choices that they could have made, and it looks functional, but in fact the form isn't. It's usually a red herring.
It is.
With watches, of course, I mean, they started out in the beginning part of the 20th century, basically a military idea, because you couldn't be pulling out a pocket watch and get shot.
Totally right on. They came out during World War I because people needed to be able to look at the time quickly. And
they were small.
Yeah, small size, so that they didn't get in the way, so that you didn't get stuck if you were trying to go through some
Well, they
train
were
or
considered. They were initially considered effeminate, right? Like men wanted a pocket watch.
Men had big pocket watches, and ladies wore these very little thin bracelets that were called cocktail watches. A lot of times the timekeeping part was covered, because you didn't want to be seen to be looking at your watch at a party,
because it would show how bored you were with your husband and the party and stuff like that.
So
that would be
all
bad.
these watches had these little hinged covers on the timekeeping, so it just looked like a nice bracelet.
I haven't seen that. I think it'd be interesting to discuss, like, one thing about this stuff, and it's the audio as well as the watches. It's a male thing.
Yeah, definitely. It's one of the
great
male things.
Women are also interested in the time, and they're also interested in beautiful things. And I know women are interested in sound and music, and yet women don't show up. It's a super male-dominated thing.
Yeah.
These watches are very big and masculine.
They are. I think that some of them are bigger than others, and I think that some of them could be worn by a lady or something. But they tend to be big watches that were used for a particular purpose, tool watches, if you will. And it's just something that attracts me about these kind of watches that were used for a particular purpose, that are just very stylized.
Yeah, this was a dive watch ostensibly. This was a aeronautics.
This is a pilot's watch. This is the Omega Flightmaster. That's from 1969 to 71, and it was made sort of to be a pilot's watch by Omega. And if you look at the back of it, there's a Douglas DC-8 airplane engraved on the back of it.
Okay.
And it has different time zones, it has day-night indicators. And, you know, a lot of people are into the Speedmaster, but to me, the Flightmaster just has a more dynamic look to it. Not everybody has it, they never reissued it.
So let's talk about, like, you know, there's sort of similarities in what happened with audio, right, in the 20th century.
Sure.
And what happened with watches. The wristwatch caught on. I guess, when do you think that, like, men started to see a wristwatch as a masculine accoutrement to being like a well put together guy?
I think by the time of the 30s, there were a lot of sort of masculine watches of the 30s that were
well, like this.
like that. That was considered a very, very tough guy watch.
Well, I don't see myself as a tough guy, but this is a Longines.
Yeah, it's stainless steel. This is
From
when
the
stainless
30s.
steel came out, was in the 30s. They
Right.
were using it in construction, like in the Chrysler Building, Empire State Building. And
So very, very simple. And then where's that big Longines that you just showed me?
this is a big
Amazing.
Longines from the 70s, is right here.
this one.
So this is one of my favorite
So-
Longines models.
So it's the same company. This is 40 years later. And this is a really interesting thing because, you know, the reverse happened in audio. In the early part of audio, people were very proud to have a very large, you know, speaker and a very expensive turntable and amplifier, and it was mono. And then, you know, they needed that because the tube amplifier didn't have much power.
Right.
And so the speaker had to be big and efficient, usually with a horn, so that, you know, it would be loud enough and sound realistic enough. And then, you know, with solid state, really 60s, 70s, you know, it got so cheap to do a transistor amplifier with a ton of power, and then the speaker could get shrunk down because you just hit it with a lot of power because it was cheap power, and then you kind of get the same basic sound pressure level out of the speaker until it starts to distort, of course. So in other words, what happened is with audio, the equipment went from big and proudly big to smaller and smaller, and now, of course, it's disappeared. So rich people are very proud to have speakers in the ceiling, like Target or Costco, and you know, everything got shrunk, and you know, it's kind of, to me, like and wristwatches got bigger, and SUVs and McMansions, all these things got bigger, whereas audio went from big and then got smaller to the point of it's a disappearing act.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the period of audio that I'm really interested in is the 70s also. I mean, I like that decade of style, and there was something exciting about those receivers that they're developing in those years.
Yeah.
They looked really cool. It was sort of the power war. They were going up in wattage.
Yeah.
You know.
The Marantz with the little oscilloscope thing.
Sure.
Was that might have been the one you were thinking of, that Sol Marantz was involved. That was the end of the
Model
company.
19.
That was the end of the company. That cost more. The Model 19 receiver had this oscilloscope. It was a super cool looking thing. And I remember reading that it cost more to make than to sell, and that was kind of the end of Sol Marantz. And Marantz, they sold the name of the company, just like so many virtually every watch company has been sold and sold. And so you get, like, there's no Longines left in Longines, there's no Hamilton left in Hamilton, there's no, it's all these names flying around that are just bullshit.
I mean, there are some that are sort of true.
Well, except for the super expensive watches made today by, I don't know, Richard Mille or something.
Those true.
There is a Richard Mille,
But Rolex has always been under the same ownership. I mean, that's one that stayed. And even though Omega and Zenith are now controlled by the Swatch Group and LVMH, they're still made in the same factory they were. They still have the same tooling. They still have the records from the old one. And the same with Longines.
They're still real watches. So that, I mean, in the case of audio, well, actually, another really interesting point of comparison, because I know that you have this sense about culture and our time, and you have all your cars. Not all. I know that there's a modern one in the lot.
There's some modern
but you know,
ones,
you've got a bunch of old Cadillacs.
Yes.
Not old.
No, but from a certain
70,
period,
80,
late 60s, early 70s.
Where there was a sense, you know, with the object, whether it was a watch or a car, or certainly with audio equipment, there was an integrity to it. and that, well, they're both analog devices,
Yeah,
right?
there was-
Audio, turntables, records, analog.
In a lot of ways, the 70s was sort of the last days of the old technology and the first days of the new technology.
And when you say new, meaning digital, meaning
Yeah,
computers?
meaning that you had some transistors in the car, you had some solid state equipment in the stereo, you had these early quartz watches. That was, there was technology, but the way it was made was very old world.
Yeah.
So, this might have been.
Yeah, this watch is actually fascinating.
We're going to look at this watch.
Because
and
this thing
watch
is
right here.
so ridiculously impressively heavy and done.
Yeah, so this was Omega's flagship model for 1972. It was the Constellation Mega Quartz 2.4, and this was the most accurate watch in the world at the time. And it's a large size, it's very heavy construction, and the dial is made of stone. It's adventurine. And this is an in-house movement. It was made to be the most accurate movement. They used it in marine chronometers for the wrist and also for the ship. And this thing was whoppingly expensive when it was new. It was $2,500 in 1972,
Right.
which today would be, $30,000 or something. It's the same with these receivers. If you look up how much they cost new,
Right.
I mean, the Marantz
They're a
Model
really good
19
value,
was like
yeah.
$1,000 in 1970, which is similar.
But this is a quartz watch, and so, the whole received impression about value is quartz swatch. It's junk. It's cheap. It's become
It's true.
valueless,
But
cheap junk. Even though this was the absolute pinnacle of
Right.
craftsmanship and engineering in 1972, you said?
Absolutely. And the thing about it is that for a long time, sort of the goal was to make a really good electric watch. And I have different
Yeah, we're going to look
examples
at the
of
Boulevard.
electric watches here.
Yeah.
And you can sort of see the progression of sort of the different, generations of the electric watch, because this has been, for many years, this was sort of a goal of, horologists, watch companies to make a reliable electric watch, because back in the day, you might have had a mechanical watch, something like this, but you had to use this to tell time. That was your only way, and these things dirt would affect them, the gravity would affect them.
That's my watch.
They had to be serviced
The
frequently.
ancient one.
This is a beautiful watch. We service this, and it's,
It's working good.
really nice piece. Can be serviced to work forever, but what they wanted in this sort of post-war period in America was sort of to develop a reliable electric watch.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about
Let's talk about it.
that relationship of what the thing is supposed to be doing and why we want it and why we feel the way we do about it.
Well, I think-
So wait.
Go ahead.
So in the beginning, you had to have a mechanical wind-up wristwatch
Right.
to tell the time. And you didn't have cell phones, and you
No.
didn't have, in train stations or public places, I guess, they had big clocks. But that was how you told time, by your wristwatch.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know this old watchmaker, and he grew up in that era where the watch had to be used to tell time. There was no other alternative, and it was mainly a tool.
The quality of the watch was indexed to the accuracy of the watch, and they were trying to get closer and closer to just perfect accuracy, which there's no perfect in anything, not in sound either. I'm going to try and draw like a correlation between the idea of accuracy and value and worth. So, we moved into a situation where the technology changed. It went from the mechanical movements to the electrical, and then, would you call that these tuning fork things, which were before quartz, right?
Right, so this is pre-quartz. This is a Bulova Akachon, which
This is a super interesting watch.
has a tuning fork in it, and that tuning fork has coils on it, and the tuning fork vibrates and runs an index wheel in there, and as a result, you get this perfectly smooth sweeping second hand. And this is sort of the second generation in electric watches.
Yeah,
And this was made in New York City. It was made in Queens.
Long Island City, huh?
And, it's just a very interesting concept. It has a sound to it from the tuning fork.
Yeah, so this is very interesting, that like this watch, you can put a mechanical watch up to your ear and you hear the click, 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 which is, I think, very reassuring. This, however, there's something almost mystical about this, because this produces this tone which you can tell is not digitally originated. It's something very precisely made, a tiny little tuning fork vibrating like a tiny musical instrument so accurately that it was, I guess, more accurate than any of these watches until you get to the quartz.
Sure.
And when you get to the quartz and to the digital, well, we might as well say goddbye to accuracy because it's all the same.
There's a point where it doesn't mean
matter
anything
anymore.
I mean, I think that the history of these electric watches, you go from these early Hamiltons like this, which is the same as a mechanical watch with a balance wheel, and it literally has a coil on there and contacts, which are making little sparks in there if I have the watch running. With these watches, the best thing to do is honestly not run them when you're not using them.
Right.
Because they're not the most reliable watches, but they were beautifully designed, and it was very optimistic. I mean, just this post-war optimism, you know, and there's just something about the styles of the 1950s that I really like because it just, you know, we had just won the war and we're kind of on top of things.
An exuberance.
It was exuberance. It was very
exuberance, yes.
Very optimistic time, and this watch in particular, the Hamilton Ventura, was designed by a famous designer, Richard Arbib, who had also worked in the auto industry. So there is this correlation between this watch and the design of it and the cars at the time. But then by the time the early 60s approached, the Accutron was made, and this was the first. So this is an electric watch, but technically this is electronic. This has resistors and transistors in it.
Yeah.
And so this is the first electronic watch, really.
And you were explaining to me, because I always liked the fact that I don't own one of these things. Actually, I got a really nice Accutron from you.
Oh, absolutely.
Which I wear when I know I'm like a long meditation session where I can't wind, where I'm not going to be moving, so the fact that you can see all the guts, I love that. That wasn't initially the intention of the company.
Not at all.
What happened, you said that this was almost an accident, that they wanted to, in jeweler stores, they cut out the dial and they wanted to show the people, the customers.
Right, so this model is called a space view. So that's basically, you can see the movement inside. And you know, maybe this is really the closest idea to form follows function, because this is a machine in here, but it is beautiful. You know, and that's really what that concept, I think, means at heart. But basically, when they delivered the Accutron to the watch dealers, they would provide one of them with the visible movement. And basically, people came in and they said, I want that one. So the jewelers would convert a regular Accutron with a dial to space view.
By cutting?
They would just take the dial out, there's a spacer you can put in, and they made crystals with the numerals printed on them.
So they wanted to see what was going on in there. So, you know, with the audio equipment today, you know, we're kind of making stuff, because you own DeVille's.
I love them, yeah.
That's, you know, it's pretty transparent to what it is, the wood. There's nothing on it that's trying to get your, like a lot of watches, as they get later and later, they're like screaming for attention.
Yeah, they're definitely exuberant kind of designs.
As the market got more crowded, like in the beginning with audio, you just had to show up with a speaker that worked, and people were like, I want that. They just wanted the sound in their homes.
I think you're right.
And then over time, like as the ecosystem gets populated and it gets more and more ferocious, the competition, the individual specimens start sprouting all sorts of little gizmos and gewgaws and stuff to attract the attention of the pollinating consumers.
Sure.
And then you kind of lose the point, which in the case of, watches, it was initially about precision, but then it went to something else. In the case of audio, it was definitely about precision because you wanted the sound to be as accurate as possible. Now we're in a different place, and now we've got kind of very bling audio components, which are not quite as precise as I'd like to see. But the interesting thing is, at this point, right, we don't need wristwatches.
No.
We can get the time someplace, but you and I, we love wristwatches.
We love them.
And, you know, for you, I can tell you, you know, what watches mean for me. It's having these incredibly beautiful little machines on your wrist, which when you open them up and look at how they're made and the incredible engineering and craftsmanship, it's just extremely like reassuring to me.
Absolutely.
And I know that, you know, people, and I also express, you know, like this, yeah, I'm going to wear this today. I'm feeling a little, you know, sort of sporty and advanced. I got this from you. I love this. This is a 63 Zodiac?
This
is
is
later.
early 70s.
70s.
This is the Zodiac Seawolf. So basically, the Seawolf was one of the first dive watches. It came out in 1953 alongside the Rolex. They both came out in the same year.
1953, yeah.
And they produced the Seawolf for many years. And by the early 70s, when sort of the colorful watches were coming into play, they took the regular case they'd always used, and they gave sort of a really interesting gray acrylic bezel with the orange text, and then this kind of cool two-tone dial.
This is so beautiful thing. But then again, I mean, I'm super into watches from the 1920s. I got that also from you.
It kind of crosses over in a way, though, because it's a classic size like the watches of the 20s.
They're all
and 30s.
small. All
They're
my
not
watches, all my watch. Well, I actually have some bigger ones, but most of the things I have, and certainly what I get these days, they're all in the smaller. Like, I'm not trying to show off, you know, size range, or I just can't. I feel like I can't pull off wearing some of these things. Like,
I think you could wear some of these. I think it's about the style. You like this sort of early machine age look, which I love. I'm a big fan of it. Watches that, let's say, I like, and the watches that you like are the size. You know, you look at these watches, and the first thing you think of is, wow, that's so big.
Well, my big thing with like when we think of audio and watches is audio started out as big, and then shrunk down like Honey, I Shrunk the Stereo into like nothing, into the ceiling or little Sonos thing, and watches got from small to big, and I'm kind of in a weird place because I like big audio, and I kind of like this. I feel like I can carry the smaller ones. Some of these things get like weapon size.
So what I have here is Zenith El Primero. So this, of all the watches, is sort of my favorite of the Zenith El Primero movement. And it's a big watch. It's 43 millimeters.
It's a huge watch, yeah.
And it's known as the TV case, which is funny because the Zenith Watch Company was bought by the Zenith TV Company.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think you should try this watch on.
Okay, I'll do that. But why did watches get so big? Like they went from, this is a Longines from the 1930s. I really like this watch, stainless.
It's beautiful. I love the stepped back. It's got the stepped case. That was a big thing of the 30s. And then the back on it is also stepped.
This is like, it's hard if I had to pick a watch that sort of summarizes what I like in watches. This is Longines. It's a big difference, right? It's 40 years later?
It's a big difference.
This is 70s?
That's 1972. So, yeah, it's a larger size. It's 43 millimeters, but it's a different thing. I mean, this is sort of the beginning of stainless steel. This is sort of the Art Deco period, maybe the end of that.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is sort of 1970s design, and I think that Zenith is...
So why did watches get so big?
I mean, I
know why stereos got small, but...
In the sporting watches, the diver watch, the pilot watch, they were always sort of big, and a lot of these chronographs are just that way so that they're more legible either underwater or in the cockpit of an airplane.
Yeah. Well, that's, so, you know, the Nazis, the Beer, this is not working out for me, you're gonna help me out. So I confess that I always thought that the Beer, that huge Luftwaffe, you know, this was a watch that the face is like this big, and the Nazi pilots wore it over their leather coat. You know, they were at 30,000 feet or something with no oxygen, freezing. So they had their coats on, and this was how this huge watch, they see how they bombed the fuck out of the people, you know, in the rest of Europe. And then the watches today, some of them like that size or bigger, and you're not bombing a city.
Yeah, the tool purpose of it has sort of been lost, but these are from sort of the golden age of, you know, flight, the golden age of still doing these things mechanically, and I think that, that thing's pretty.
Well, I mean, I you know, it
just has that look of the 1970s stereo equipment.
It definitely. Well, this is true. it does have the vibe of like a Marantz 19. We were talking about that earlier, which was this oscilloscope receiver that you like.
I like it. I think
And it's
that
super cool looking.
it's very neat looking. It's really exuberant, and the same way these watches
Yeah,
are.
and it cost actually so much to make that it kind of put Sol Marantz out of business, which is another interesting thing about like how we value, what we spend on things. Like now, people don't spend money on audio equipment at all.
Yeah, it used to be a big thing. It
Used to be a
every
big
guy
investment.
had it was an audiophile, he had his equipment, he had this receiver,
Right.
the speakers. It was a big deal. It was just as big as what kind of car he had or what kind of watch he had.
Right.
You know,
And now, like watches, I mean, spending a lot of money on watches, but nothing on your sound system, that's the norm. Okay, we should fix that. What do you think, what do you think it said, well, how do you see people like showing themselves through their watches? How do you, because you deal with this, so you bring these watches to people.
I think there's a couple of different ways that people can show themselves with watches. I think a lot of people sort of
present.
No, it's not necessarily that. I think with the watches that I sell, they tend to be less about prestige, although there are some prestige watches here, but more about personal individual expression. And I think that, a lot of the people today just don't dress as formally as they used to. So a lot of these sport watches sort of go with the attire that people use. And, these watches, this person might not be a pilot or they might not be, owning a yacht or something, but you can sort of have that rugged look and sort of have that tool watch that kind of expresses that. And I think that, I love dress watches too, and I think that sometimes it's hard. People just don't wear a lot of dress clothes anymore.
No, you'd think though that, to be really cool to wear a tracksuit or something like of that level of formality, but with a super formal, cool, vintage.
There's nothing better.
That would be fucking cool, but you don't see people doing that.
There's nothing better than seeing someone with a T-shirt and a Patek Philippe on or something. It's pretty cool. I like that look.
But a restrained Patek.
Yeah, restrained
So
one.
what do you think is the because the audio that we make is really, it's analog. You can hook up a digital receiver, a digital anything to it, but especially records.
Especially records.
Well, we could talk about this. Both records and that kind of, right? Because watches were not a thing 20 years ago.
Because when it was true, for about a decade in the 90s, I just feel like people didn't wear a watch. And a lot of people would go around and say, sort of aggressively in your face, I don't wear a watch.
Yeah.
And it was like...
What happened then?
Because it was about timekeeping at the time, purely, and people had other ways to keep time, whether it was on a computer or a tablet or something, or an iWatch, something like that. And nowadays, I think people wear watches to say something about who they are.
Yeah.
It's a piece of art that you can wear. It's one of the few pieces of jewelry that a man can really get away with, other than maybe a ring or a cufflinks or something. Yeah. But the watch, it just could go everywhere with you. And I think that the fun thing about having a sort of a variety of different styles is that you don't have to be the same person every day. You can be sportier, you can be a little bit dressy if you're going out to a restaurant or something like that. It allows you to sort of express the different kinds of moods that you...
That's Elvis's Midas.
Yeah, so this is, well...
Solid gold.
Solid gold, 200 grams of gold.
This is
serious watch.
Elvis had this, right?
He owned one of these watches.
He probably owned everything, but this is like 2 pounds of solid gold, Rolex Midas. This is actually super cool. Not my thing, but I get this.
It's a watch that's so extreme that it doesn't even need to have any hyperbole.
Yeah, the bracelet and the whole...
It's 200 grams of watch.
So let's actually talk about design. And, we've been talking about how watches got bigger. You gave the argument that it was legibility, but I think that's kind of bullshit. I think that things got bigger. I think that things get bigger because we've changed culturally, and everything, it expresses like bigger is better because bigger is like richer, more expensive, with cars and houses.
I think things got bigger to a point and then they started to get smaller. I mean, I think that, we're talking about the era here of the jumbo jet. I mean, of the 747. You had the biggest airplane ever made. You had QE2, the biggest cruise liner ever made. I mean, this was all about making things big in your face. I mean, these great cars every year would get longer, the Cadillacs and Lincolns, these kind of things. And today, certain things are big and certain things aren't big, you know?
Well, the audio equipment got shrunk. Right? We agree that like audio got basically reduced to zero.
It's also, there was a big emphasis on digital, and I feel like that was seen to be sort of a red herring, like it was the greatest thing in the world.
Yeah.
People threw their records out, but now people are rediscovering this.
Big time.
And people are realizing that of that sound wave, that the best digital in the world is only taking a sample of that.
Exactly. And then, you know, I don't know how to correlate, but, you know, there is a correlation between the vinyl audio experience, which is analog, and these watches, which these are all analog, but with the exception of the Omega Constellation, which is a quartz watch, but I guess it's still, they're analog devices.
Well, I think what it has to do with
They're not a sampling of reality. They are what they are.
They are reality. And I think that it has a lot to do with sort of this movement towards authenticity. I know it sounds like a buzzword, but there's a lot of things in life that people hold value to because they have authenticity.
But the better way to look at it, I think, is that you flip it over. It's not like looking for it's the fact that everything is so inauthentic.
Right.
Everything is so sort of mass-produced with no intention except how to take money from people, that it's just fake feeling. So you live in this fake world and you want something that feels real.
Right.
Whether it's food or drink or an object. Now, with design, these are analog. You know, what's interesting is again, another point of comparison with audio is audio has to be designed, but it has a function. These watches have a design, but they have to function. That's the thing with design. It has to function as well as look good.
Right, and it's the same with a car or an airplane or any kind of great piece of industrial design. And I think that that's what I just gravitate towards in my life is beautiful industrial design.
Yeah, you have a very sculptural. Jed always, whenever he comes, it's, there's always a bunch of watches that are just little sculptures or that have this Bulova Space View that we discussed earlier. What year is this?
That's from I think that's from 1965. That's a really nice watch.
This was the ultimate, this was extremely expensive,
wasn't it? It's about $275 in 1965, which is about the same price today as, it was about the same price as a Rolex Datejust.
A Rolex. This was the same price as a Rolex Datejust.
Right.
Okay.
Bulova Accutron was sort of considered to be America's Rolex, something that you wouldn't think of today, but it really was. I mean, a Rolex Datejust was about $275.
Another Bulova made really cool watches from whoever was doing the design work.
Yeah, I don't think it's really known who the design was.
They were very, very, cool sensibility.
Another one of the theories that people like, the things people are interested in, is sort of this idea of locally grown, locally made.
Yeah.
We're in New York, and Bulova's a New
Bulova
York
is
company.
our watch
They
company.
were literally made right in Queens. So,
we were talking about design. You were bringing up this idea of the informational aspect of the design.
Right. So basically, there's two different kinds of design, I think, in watches, and I think in a lot of things.
Yeah.
There's something that's designed as a beautiful work of art. So here's a couple of examples of, this Rolex Cellini 4127. It's a beautiful watch, hobnail case. It's really just sort of a work of art. It's a sculpture for your wrist. It tells the time, but it doesn't have markers at every hour, so it's not that easy to tell the time. This is sort of the boss's watch. He doesn't really care what minute it is,
Yeah.
But it's a piece of art for the wrist. And the other one that we were talking about before is the King Midas. I mean, the case is almost a symbol. It was designed by Gerald Genta, one of the sort of premier watch designers of the 20th century. And it just has this really sculptural look to it. It's beautiful design, beautiful art.
This is solid gold. It weighs a ton.
This is solid gold. So Rolex,
Amazing thing.
you wouldn't think of it today, but Rolex sort of made tough tool watches back in the day, and they wanted to really distinguish themselves with something to be considered a luxury watch. Mm-hmm. So this was their effort at making something that was a luxury watch, and they were just beautifully constructed. They were designed by a famous designer. They were a lot of gold, 200 grams of gold, and when you put the watch on its side like this, it was meant to resemble sort of Greek architecture on its side.
I know that.
It's supposed to look like the Parthenon while put on its side.
That's pretty funny.
And if anybody had any questions as to what kind of a watch you're wearing, it's written right on the side here, King Midas. You know, with this really cool sort of buzzsaw crown in the center. There's a lot of little details on that watch. And for all of you Rolex sport fans, this was the first Rolex with a sapphire crystal, was the King Midas. So this is another watch that looks like sculpture. But then we get into information design. So what's great information design is how easy something is to read. So one of these watches that I really like is the Hoya Regatta. Now this is a cool looking watch. It's sort of an interesting style, very sort of Cartier looking in the bracelet. It's got this sort of Gerald Genta-esque look from 1980s style. But then something's interesting here. You click this button, this is a tool watch. So now you're reading elapsed time sort of in shades of these 5 circles. So you've got
Clever.
5 minutes elapsed in blue and then 5 minutes elapsed in orange circles. And it just really makes it easy to go and look down at your watch and see how much time has elapsed.
So now let's look at, like, because you have, I know, a Pioneer receiver. You help me, you get my watches fixed, and I repair your electronics.
It was
over
one
in
of
my
the things.
shop.
My
Think about
ne'er-do-well electronics.
and you know what the electronic components in a stereo system look like in that time, because you're a connoisseur of all this
And I've looked at them.
shit. So how do you relate that is? And by the way, it's quite interesting that we haven't developed an aesthetic of audio for subsequent. We just keep reverting back to, it feels, either retro stuff or very, very poor contemporary, like wannabe Apple design.
Yeah, there are a few, it's almost like the design of this era doesn't really know what it wants to be like.
That's
you
a
could look
very-
at a receiver from the 70s
Yeah.
or from the 60s,
Yeah.
or even from the 80s when they went to the silver face, to the 90s when it was all black.
Yeah.
And everybody sort of knew what a receiver looked like, and they sort of knew what fashion looked like, and they sort of knew what a lot of various things looked like from the year. It seems like recently, especially with high-end stereo equipment, there's no sort of one standard that they all go to.
No, because they're reacting to different, we want to be like Apple, like Jonathan Ive designed this, or we want to be like, this, a retro Marantz Macintosh thing, or really, really bad hybrids of things that should never have been, those two animals should never have mated.
Right, they make a lot of neoclassical looking things where there's a lot of things that are retro inspired on them, and then
Well,
there's
this is
something
also the
that kinda
case in
ruins
watches.
it. Yeah.
Today's watches are a disaster of sort of postmodernist mishmash.
You know what the worst of this is, unfortunately, is Longines.
Yeah, I
Like,
know.
you have this classic Bauhaus Longines here. This is just a perfect example of sort of 1940s Longines
I
design.
love that watch.
And they made a reissue of this watch recently.
Oh,
and
did
it
they?
gets to exactly what you're talking about. So this watch, is probably around 32, 33 millimeters. It's not big,
No.
but the reissue is like 40 millimeters, gigantic.
Yeah.
And then the other thing about the reissue is it has a date at the bottom,
Yeah, no, that's
which is,
kills it.
it doesn't have anything to do with this time period. It's, sort of like watching one
You
of
get the
these-
feeling that a reissue like that was done by, by focus groups or by algorithm.
There are people in Switzerland who I've spoken to that are into watches, and they just look at watches and sort of based on how many different requirements it can satisfy.
Yeah.
Like, does it have a sapphire crystal? Does the crown screw down? Is it at least 42 millimeters, although
Yeah.
that's going down
Yeah.
lately? Does it have
This is exactly
An
how
anti-reflective coating.
audio equipment is designed today. If it's high-end turntables, if it doesn't have vacuum hold down, which you don't need, no, that can't be good. It has to be. There's a whole laundry list of bullshit desiderata that anyone who really knows goes like, no, we don't want that. What we want to do is this.
right?
But this stuff is being designed by, by the most short-sighted economic decision-making, I would say.
It's almost not even short-sighted. It has to do with sort of, I think, the thrust of the corporate mentality is they don't want to get in trouble. So they come up with these things that satisfy all these requirements, A, B, and C, and D, but they're not thinking outside the box because that could yield them getting in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if they do everything and they say, this piece of stereo equipment has satisfied all of these requirements. It might not be beautiful. Nobody's going to be caring
not
about it
sound
in
good.
50 years. It might not even sound good.
Yeah.
But it satisfies all the requirements.
You just touched on something that I think is really important, at least for me, and that is that, like, all these watches, these are 50 years old, 60 years old, 70. This is 98 years old.
98 years old.
This is
so
1927.
Cool. And these all do essentially the same thing.
And they all work.
You can take a piece of equipment here from the 1920s, like you're looking at there, and it still essentially does the same thing as a watch today.
They work and they make you happy, you know, doing their work on your body. Whereas I don't think that, like, audio, almost anything made to audio equipment, that it's going to have those legs. I don't think people are going to want it. I mean, what we make, you own a pair. When we designed it and built those, it was to last for, you know, functionally forever.
What are my feelings about things just in general, whether it's stereo equipment or watches or cars, or I like to buy something good, but I don't want to have to buy it again.
Yeah.
And I think that mentality, you know, it's rare to find that. There's a lot of things out there that you buy that just fail all the time, and there's no finding a good one.
Yeah,
it's just they don't make it.
Good point.
The fact that you can buy a great set of speakers and it will last a long time and it can be repaired, there's something wonderful about that.
But, you know, the intention in making and designing things, I feel like these watches had it then, and the way I see making the audio equipment today is this is for somebody to buy it once and to use it and cherish it and to inform their lives. And that's how I see the watches, you know, different application, but it's the same ethos.
Well, I think with your stereo equipment, and I don't want to sound like I'm supporting you too much because I listen to your stereo equipment and I just feel like that there's something about listening to your stereo equipment that makes you, if you're a real music fan, just every song that you love, that you've sort of known like a good friend all this time, you're listening to it again for the first time. You're hearing things on that you haven't heard before, and that, you know, for someone like me who's a real music lover and just can't live without it, just has music every day no matter what, to listen to them on your set of speakers, it's just such a treat. I mean, it's it really can bring you a lot of happiness in life, and I feel like these are things that are meant to be enjoyed in life. Great designs, great friends, great music, you know, great ideas. It's part of the whole sort of Western philosophy of living this great life, searching for these great experiences. And I think that's, you know, if a great set of speakers helps you to enjoy every song that much, it was worth it.
You know, you're coming from a different era when, you know, people would, like, go home and listen to music like every day. You know? Well, I grew up like that, where, you know, and today music is a background, but, you know, the watches are kind of a happy sign or harbinger, you know, in that they became obsolete, but then people decided that they were really interesting and cool, and, you know, having them, I mean, I can't imagine going out without a watch. I feel just, because it makes me feel really happy, and I use it.
Absolutely, it's great.
But people aren't using sound. People are using wristwatches again, but it's a long way still for us to go with sound being part of people's lives. And I think, yeah, it could enrich people's experiences inordinately.
I mean, I don't think that's necessarily true. Honestly, I think that, I mean, I feel like people watch a lot of TV in their life when they're young, and then when they get older, you know, they get bored of it. At least I get bored of it. I think TV is particularly it's not entertaining. It's sort of jarring, and I think that I like to listen to music if I have time, you know, and I feel like there are a lot of people out there like that. It's not as rare as you think.
Okay.
And I think that there are a lot of speakers out there, and there are a lot of stereo systems out there, or maybe not as many as they used to be, but people don't know which one's good. It's hard to say. Nobody really keeps track of that stuff anymore.
It's a big problem how to find the information about what to want and what to look for. This is a big problem, actually. So,
I mean, it's like if everybody heard those speakers, they would be drawn to them. There's no way around it.
When I look at the watch world, I see Rolex, Patek, AP, Omega, but all the great watches that are sort of below that are at that level, and people don't really know about them. I feel it's kind of like what I do with audio, that the really cool sleeper things, you have to kind of almost find them accidentally or bump into them or somebody tells you, because the main dominant things on the internet sort of, it's like a fish trap. They end up with you in one of these sort of baskets.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you're right. I think what happens is that people, they're supposed to collect a certain amount of watches. Like you're supposed to have a Rolex Submariner, you're supposed to have an AP, you're supposed to have a Speedmaster. There's certain watches
Really?
that,
Okay.
well, I guess.
Well, you would know they're your clients.
I would
you sell
know.
these things. So.
The sort of the base core watches, there's like 6 or 10 or 20 watches that everybody should have.
Yeah.
But then I think that once people get a few of those watches and they start to sort of find their footing, and they start to say, well, I like this kind of watch, and they start to sort of go down these rabbit holes of, I like divers, and then they start collecting divers. I like military, or I like sculptural watches, or electric watches, or Hoyer. It's a whole subcategory of collecting, and I just think people sort of go down that route. But the real problem to me is that there are people out there that are collecting watches just because they're worth money.
Yeah.
And I think that, to have that fancy stereo system because it costs a lot of money, but to not appreciate music, it's very sad.
I agree. Definitely. So.
So how do we separate this stuff away from, I mean, we didn't talk about any pricing here. To me, these watches, it's about love, it's about design, it's about...
I never talk about pricing on these videos.
Well, no, you shouldn't.
No,
what I'm
I don't.
saying is that, one thing I did say is that you have an expensive turntable there, but I've never listened to something that was so worth the money as your turntable.
Thank you. That's so sweet. I appreciate that.
I mean, you listen to that, and there are things that you hear on that record that have never been heard on that record since it was pressed. There are ways to take the sound off of that I didn't know were possible. So I think that's...
Well, I would like to see more watch guys get into the audio thing for sure. Seems like a lot of the audio guys already like watches.
I think they might be. I think there's a lot of, I mean, you asked me one time who's sort of the target customer of me, watches. And I think it's sort of the most interesting men in the world, that interested in a lot of other cool things as well.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons I love doing this so much, is because I get to meet
cool
such
people.
exciting, cool people who are just into different things. And a lot of these kind of interests, whether it's stereo equipment or whether it's cars or whether it's history or whether it's architecture, a lot of people tend to be interested in that stuff as well, and so am I. And it's kind of something we can talk about, that it's not only about watches. This is sort of, in a lot of ways, the stereo systems are sort of your passport to the good life. If you start talking about this stuff, this is what all the interesting people like. It's what all the cool people like, whether it's stereos or watches or just mechanical objects. It's sort of what we groove on in a way.
All the question of value.
It's all the question of value. So, we have a couple of different categories of watches here, and then there's a couple of other ones I can think of. So basically we have some watches that were expensive back in the day, but not that expensive now. Sort of like these high-end quartz watches or the Accutron, or these were high technology at the time, but today they're sort of worth a fraction of what they cost new.
Right.
Then there are watches, and I'm looking at you, Rolex here, that weren't that expensive when they were new, but are a lot of money now.
Yeah.
So this watch,
Especially Rolexes.
which I love, by the way, my favorite Rolex GMT,
That one is cool.
is the root beer. So this was made in the 70s. This one is from 1979, and it was 16753 as a reference. And when it was new in 79, it was probably around $300. Not really a lot of money. But today, this watch is fairly valuable. So this is sort of the opposite. And then there are watches that they make today, which I guess
fortune and
tend to cost a fortune and also tend to be sort of derivative. But if you think about how derivative they are, they're actually not that bad, because, well, think about it. I mean, a watch of today, which is an automatic timepiece, stainless steel case, I mean, they still make manual wind movements. That would be almost as if you could go into the mall and get a tube receiver still. Because it pretty much is the same technology that they used back then.
Yeah.
So in some ways, watches have really sort of stayed true to what they were. You can buy a manual wind watch, you know, and one of the things I love about them is like all the great cars have sort of been ruined, but there's no regulations about watches. We're not hurting the environment here. We can still make them as they were.
That's
There's something
interesting.
very nice about that.
I mean, would you say that like a Zenith or a Longines or any, you know, Rolex made today is better, same, or worse than from these
I'd say
this
it's
period?
similar in a lot of ways. I'd say that one of the things also I like about sort of this period of the early 70s is that they got a lot of the things right. They were sort of struggling all these years to make, you know, great items. And by this time, by the 70s, it was sort of the modern era, and they sort of got a lot of these things right. Like this El Primero movement, Zenith El Primero movement. You know, it came out in 1969, and this is just a really beautiful example from the 70s. But for many years, up until 2004, they used this movement in Rolex, in the Rolex Daytona. So there are a lot of examples in the watch industry of them using something nowadays, which essentially was developed in the 70s. You know, and the other thing, you know, we look at a lot of these watches. This is a military watch, Benrus Type 2 from the late 70s, and it still has a lot of the features that people would use on a modern military watch. The new version is not, you know, automatic or mechanical. That's his too. That's beautiful as well. That's the field watch. So
No, this is not Benrus.
this is
Hamilton.
this is a Hamilton field watch, which is actually an Air Force version, manual wind, 1982, almost the last year of that watch. And the one I have is a Benrus here, and these were both made in USA with Swiss movements, and just really legible in a way that, you know, military watches have to be. But this is a category that people really do love to collect, are military watches. And this one has an interesting story. You know, I live sort of right near where the factory that Benrus was, you know, and they used to be in Ridgefield, Connecticut. So this watch, Benrus's were made in Ridgefield, Connecticut. But the movements were imported from Switzerland. So one of my friends, his father was one of the head watchmakers at Benrus, and he's allowed me over the years to buy some things from his personal collection, and this is his Benrus Type 2. So it's, I'm sort of, in a way, the original owner on this watch.
Amazing.
You know, and this wasn't a watch you could buy in the store. This was issued to the military. This is issued to Navy SEALs and people in underwater demolition teams, and that was pretty much it. So, you know, Benrus, in 1964, they sort of won the government contract to make military watches, and that was one of the things that kept them alive through the 70s. You know, they ended up going out of business in 1978, but it was these military watches that they made. And just, again, locally made. Another one of these things that we like to talk about.
Yeah.
Beautiful design.
Yeah.
And this is great information design.
Yeah.
So you could use this watch for a
The
variety
best out of all these, actually.
You could use this watch for a variety of functions. So one of the things, this is a dive watch. This was made to be, you know, water resistant to 600 meters, screw down crown. But up here, you've got this tool for telling time in different time zones. Just a nice, you've got the triangle for showing your elapsed time underwater, but you have this hour markers here on the bezel for showing time in different time zones. And now this is another thing I love about vintage watches is look at that bezel. That's made out of an acrylic plastic, and it has basically, the numbers are carved out from the back and then painted in the back, and you get sort of this 3D effect on the markers. And just the way that they put the effort into making those hour markers look three-dimensional, you know, making the dome of the crystal sort of the same as the arc of the bezel. It's just little design features that you know they wouldn't bother to do on a modern watch. There's a certain, you know, it's a really designed object, and that's what I love about it. And that's why I think people gravitate towards this. They don't know why.
Yeah.
This is still a very popular
This is
design.
very interesting. So, you know, what you've done is you've sort of deciphered, also for me, what's happening design-wise on each aspect The case is also really cool. And things that it'd be easy to miss if you weren't a specialist or an expert in these things. But the fact that the overall total, whole of it is, as you say, extremely pleasing.
Yeah.
It's great, that you can actually take it apart and go, this is why it's pleasing.
Well, I think that's the thing about it. I think that a lot of these watches, they have interesting details, but it has to work all together. It has to look like something which is a sum of the details in a really pleasing way.
But a
I
lot
feel like
of
this watch
modern
does
watches,
that.
they don't. They look like a Frankenstein. That's kind of the definition of Frankenstein, an assemblage of parts that don't really belong together.
Yeah, you'll see
but,
that.
But they sort of, but they add up to a thing.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, I think that modern watches can certainly look bigger and uglier than they need to look, but I think that you've seen some designs recently that have sort of gotten back to the basics with this stuff, and it's, some of these watches, like I could go out and buy a reissue of this. It's made by a friend of mine, Ben Russ. It's a great watch. Mm-hmm. It's not as delicate and durable as the original, but it is a way to enjoy this watch in a relatively new way without having to worry about hurting it.
Yeah.
This is essentially dead stock. I don't want to mess it up, but
No.
I could mess up the new version. It looks fine with some dents in it. But I hear what you're saying. And I mean, I think one of the other things to look at on a lot of modern watches is they have really wide bracelets.
Yeah.
Like,
Thought of that.
this is sort of the Submariner here. This is my Submariner. So many people like the Rolex Submariner. To me, the Tudor Submariner is the more interesting one. It's more iconoclastic. Mm-hmm. So instead of having the traditional black dial with the Mercedes hands, it has this sort of off-the-wall blue dial with these markers, square markers, and sort of the hour hand is nicknamed the snowflake hand because it has that shape to it.
Yeah, that's very cool.
So this has sort of this golden proportion, if you will, of 40 millimeters with a 20 millimeter lug width. And that's just, for a lot of guys' wrists, that's a very good size. The modern Rolex, it's sort of similar in dimensions, but it has a 22 millimeter lug width, and it just makes the watch so big and blingy and uncomfortable, and it's cutting into your wrist. And there was just no need to make it bigger and heavier. Nobody needed that. One of the things about...
That's how all audio equipment gets, all components, they just make them bigger and heavier. This has happened with amplifiers now. They're like the size of reefer things on trucks. They're like this big, I swear. And then the bass that you put underneath them to make them look even more impressive, that adds another $20,000. Or then the speakers are now 800 to 1,000 pounds per side.
Well,
and I mean, it's turntables at 600 pounds. It's crazy.
this kind of goes along with my feeling about Rolex. Like when I was a kid, I always interested in Rolex as a brand because it's this luxury brand. Everybody just cares about it like they would with a Cadillac, like a Rolex. It's the Rolex of garden hoses. It's just something you want to know about when you're a kid, especially. And the first time I ever saw a Rolex, this guy, I went up to this guy as a friend of my family. I said, "Oh, that's a Rolex, right?" And he's like, "Yeah, you want to look at it?" So he passed it to me, and the first thing that struck me was how light it is. It was a Datejust. It wasn't the GMT, but it was so light, and I was like, "Wow, that's light." And it started me thinking the idea that could a luxury good be luxurious and light? And the answer was that it was made to be light. It was made to feel like a feather on your wrist. And modern day watches, they have this sort of blingy, heavy look where weight is equated with value.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work as well as a watch.
Yeah.
The watch should be light on your wrist. Like you admire with the small watches, these Rolexes, even though they're a little bit bigger, they're light because the bracelets aren't so heavy. And, modern day people are sort of conditioned to view weight and value at the same. So
Yeah, I mean, that happiness does not come by the pound.
people
Sorry.
are sort of getting the watches they deserve in a way.
I'm glad I didn't say that because people would be very unhappy if I said that in the comments. But anyway,
Right, well,
it's good you did.
I
I
said it.
agree with you.
And I like a heavy watch. I'm not going against it, but to just look at a watch in the view only of its weight, only of how
Chunky it is.
expensive does it feel when you lift it up, isn't really a good way of evaluating watches.
But as we said, it's like the McMansion, Hummer H3, you know, SUV, you know, the super furniture,
The furniture is
supersizing
gigantic.
of, it's, you know,
And it's all held together with staples, but it's big.
Yeah.
The house is gigantic, but it's made of cardboard.
restoration hardware, yeah.
I mean, literally, the plywood is too good for houses nowadays.
Yeah.
It has to be made of that spun MDF board.
Yeah.
Like, as soon as that gets
OSB.
wet, exactly.
Oriented strand board.
So, you know, even though things get bigger, the quality of them gets worse. And I think one of the interesting things with watches to think about is sort of materials cost versus craftsmanship cost. So nowadays, you know, back in the day, in the 30s, particularly 20s, 30s, materials were really expensive. So you see a lot of watches with chrome plating on them, but with very high level, beautiful movements in them. Nowadays, it's the opposite. Stainless steel is almost free. So you see a lot of very big, heavy stainless steel watches, but with really cheap machine-made quartz movements.
Right.
So just that thought that somebody could, you know, the labor costs were so reasonable and there were so many skilled craftsmen out there that making movements was almost nothing to them.
Yeah.
But a couple of ounces of stainless steel, that was everything.
Yeah. Things change.
It's
Values
change.
change.
It's
Yeah.
change. So, and I think nowadays people love that sort of small micro craftsmanship that goes into a watch.
Yeah.
People like to open that up or have a display back and look at that movement going and just think to themselves, somebody made that by hand. And they do today still. I mean, if you look at modern day watches, Rolexes and Zenith and other quality brands, Patek, there are people in there hand fitting those wheels. So just the idea that you can have something that's so luxurious but also so handmade, I think that's what people appreciate. I feel like there are stereo systems with a similar level of care, maybe even in the other room.
Yeah, thank you. That's very kind of you. Yeah, we try. That was a good observation.
It was. I mean, it really just comes from listening to them and appreciating them more than anything else. You know, I feel like
Thanks.
with everything that you might want to use, it's difficult to find the best of that thing.
Yeah.
You know, and I feel like a lot of people with watches, you know, what is the best? Is Rolex the best? I know it's really good, but is it the best? You know, is Omega the best? Is Zenith the best? Is Patek the best? But I honestly think that you can enjoy all of these things, and it's fun to have sort of a few of each. It's sort of really.
Well, I would say it's a bit like music, and then it's like, what's the best music? It's like whatever makes you happy is the best music.
Yeah, I mean, for me,
So with these things, you know, there is no. I have my little watches here. And there's
They're great.
These later ones, but they're all fantastic, wonderful, beautiful things.
Right, and I think the idea is that you can enjoy both, and I think that, you know, when I got those DeVille speakers, I always listen to a lot of music, but the first thing, obviously, what's the great test of a stereo system is listening to progressive
guess,
rock,
yeah.
Pink Floyd,
Yeah.
you know, Nice and White Satin. This is the ultimate test drive of any stereo system. How does that sound? So you listen to that stuff for a while, and then I was saying to myself, oh, got to listen to some great cocktail music, Henry Mancini, you know, Nelson
Love
Riddle.
Mancini.
Listen to that.
Yeah.
Sounds amazing on there. And then, you know, day 3, we're listening to soul music. We're listening to that smooth, you know, Philly sound, 1970s. Sounds great on there too. So just everything I threw at it, which was a lot of different stuff, it all sounded good. And I think that that's, you know, I like all of these kinds of genres of music. I like, you know, and I think that to appreciate different kinds of genres of music is really interesting and great. And it's just, the watches too. I appreciate a lot of different kinds of watches. Even if it's not something I want to own or I want to live with forever, I enjoy every one of these watches so great. And I think that that's sort of a mutual appreciation for things that other people find dear is interesting to me. And I think that I love to hear why other people like things that are a little different from what I like.
That's really nice to hear, because people can be very judgmental, and that curiosity about what is it that makes you like something. That's part of what I want to have a conversation. because it's endlessly fascinating to me when somebody, especially when somebody has a kind of a sense of taste, a considered sense. What is it that's animating that sensibility?
Like, I like this weird solid state equipment from the 70s, which you obviously know about, and you're like, I would never have a piece of solid state equipment, and that makes me laugh. I think that's great. I mean, I think just that
I
great debate
I
there.
had them, by the way, but
Yeah, but
now
that
I'm
great debate
yeah.
between tube systems and solid state systems, it's just, nobody's had that debate in a long time. I think that's great. You know, we're sort of revitalizing these old sort of classic arguments.
Oh, in the audio world, they had plenty. You know, trust me.
Maybe they do now, but it's. I feel like most people that go with digital are really looking for home theater. I think that whole concept has sort of become what people buy audio systems for. And I think that just the sheer joy of listening to music, that's always sort of been in the realm of people that are into tube equipment, into analog.
Yeah.
I just think they're different things.
Yeah. Well, home theater is like, now people treat music as the soundtrack for their lives, so it is home theater, ironically. So, you know.
But more like connected with your television set.
Yeah. No, I understand.
Like, I didn't connect this thing with my television set. It's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
I'm not going to put these speakers through the indignity of having to listen to commercials and you know, the Kardashians or something. You know, we're only music on there.
All right.
Why don't we talk a little bit about? I'd like to talk a little bit about these vintage Hoyer models. You know, I think that Hoyer watches are very interesting to me, and you know, sort of have this motorsports kind of sport racing feel to them. And this is a very important model. It's the Hoyer Carrera. This was made starting in 1963. This model's from 1964. And it was one of the first models designed by Jack Hoyer, who is sort of the third generation, and in some ways the last generation where Hoyer was run by someone with that last name. And he was a design maven. You know, he was friends with a lot of the Formula One racers, and he put these watches in their hands, but he was trying to come up with good information design. And one of the things he ended up doing was he moved the outer track of the watch to the reflector ring of the crystal to sort of get it off the dial, to make it look more sleek and uncluttered. And this was, you know, pretty big contribution to the racing chronograph, and it looked very clean. And you know, just a really interesting watch from Hoyer. Then you go to this other model, which is sort of one of the last Hoyer models before they went with tag, and you know, this is just 1980s. You know, this is sort of a guilty pleasure. I mean, it's got a two-tone case. It's got these weird screws in the bracelet. You know, it's really 80s, and it's really nautical because it's a regatta. You know, it does regatta timing. So you're basically, what we're doing here is we're timing the start of a sailboat race, which I know almost nobody's going to do this with this watch, but that's what it's for. So basically, in a sailing race, a regatta, the boats can't sit still before the race starts. They have to sort of tack around in circles. So they fire off a starting pistol when you got 10 minutes to go, and one when you have 5 minutes to go, and one when the race starts. And with this watch, the person on the sailing ship, on the racing sailboat, can keep track of the time until the race starts. You know, but most likely this is more of keeping track of how many drinks you've had, you know, at the club. You know, this is, you know, it's a way to live vicariously through a cool watch. And there's a lot to be said for that. It's fun. It doesn't take itself too seriously. Mm-hmm. So we've got sort of these bookends of Hoyer, and both with motorsports or with sports. You know, we've got the motorsports regatta, we've got the yachting, or the Carrera, and the sort of yachting watch. And they're both kind of cool. So another watch I want to talk about here is this. This is another watch that we're talking about today. This is a Lucien Piccard. So this is, you know, we've seen a lot of watches here, and most of you have probably seen them before. This is a real oddball. Why do I like this watch? Well, you know, Lucien Piccard's an interesting company to me. It was a company that was started by two New York Jews in the 1920s, and they came up with this great backstory for this company that was started in the 1800s in Switzerland, and basically the Federal Trade Commission came after them and accused them of lying about their company, which is true. But look at this watch. It just has everything on it.
So over the top.
So over the top.
It's just ridiculous.
It's out of control. It's got an acrylic insert, rally bezel. You know, it's gold plated, but almost like a green gold plate, kind of brassy. It's got this dial with these interesting subdials. So basically this dial was made by a company called Singer, which also made the dials for, believe it or not, the Rolex Daytona. So if you look at the Rolex Daytona Paul Newman, it has similar subdials to this Lucien Piccard. And if you look over there on the minute counter, there's a little section for yachting, yacht timing, which is on a prototype Rolex Daytona, Yachtmaster, one of one. So this watch shares that little feature with that, you know, millions of dollars Rolex Daytona. But, you know, it's just such a cool over-the-top watch. I mean, I don't know if we can even see this, but look closely at this. You can see there's a little raised applied trident with like a wave symbol below it up on the front for the, on the top for the logo. And it's just like, look at the detailing they put into that. Just so interesting, so over the top. You know, this is design, some of these designs you see reissued, this one you're never gonna see again.
No.
So let's talk about some Bulova Accutrons. Can we talk about that? Yeah, why not, right? We're gonna talk about some Accutrons. So it's an important company to me, Bulova Accutron, and you know, you can see I've got the cufflinks here. I'm big into this brand, and the reason is that this is sort of what got me into watches. So when I was 16, a few years ago, my grandfather had given me, you know, he was a great collector of things. He was a great collector of clocks, and you know, he had some watches. He had some cool art. He was an artist, and you know, also a great businessman. He was like a madman. He was the sort of champion of the 3 martini lunch, and he gave me some watches that he owned back in the day because he knew I liked them, and this was one of them, and I had it fixed up. And it was a Bulova AccuQuartz, sort of the first time I'd ever known that this type of watch existed. And I brought it into a jewelry store in my hometown, and they serviced it up for me, and just the look of that smoothly sweeping second hand, just the sort of cool look of the watch altogether, and the fact that it was something for my family, got me into these watches. It got me into vintage watches as a thing, as a hobby. And I would, you know, go on eBay, which was a new thing at the time in the 90s, and look for vintage Accutrons. I probably should have been buying Rolexes, but
Yeah.
you know, this is sort of what turned me on with these Accutrons. And then sort of we fast forward to some of the Accutron's greatest hits. I mean, we talked about the Space View, but this is another great Bulova Accutron. Look at that thing. So that's from 1970. It was only made for 1 year, and it's called the Accutron sort of D shape. That's what people call it. And it just has this great mid-century vibe to it, sort of clockwork orange modernism. You know, it really just looks like a symbol. It looks like that style, and you know, I just like architecture of that time and design of that time, and this watch sort of fits in with it. You know, and it's got that same sort of Accutron look, and you can see the quality on it is just beautiful. Now, this was really at a time when America was the best at something still. We made the most accurate watch in these years, one of the highest quality watches at that time, right here in New York State.
What, this?
This was a very high-end watch. This kept better time than almost any watch at the time when accuracy was a big deal. And then I'm going to show you one of sort of my all-time, whoa, oh my God. Yeah, it's all right, dropping watches. Did not get damaged. I should keep all these over
that
here,
one
though.
you should keep here.
It didn't get messed up though,
Yeah,
surprisingly enough. Because I've had some watches get messed up before. So this is sort of your Bulova AccuQuartz. This is from 1973, and this is just one of the most over-the-top designed Bulova Accutrons ever made. 18K solid gold case and bracelet with sort of a Bulova Accutron tuning fork symbol as the bracelet links.
Incredible.
And AccuQuartz was their form of quartz technology where they put a quartz resonator in with the tuning fork. So on the dial, you can see here, they have the little diamond signifying quartz with a little tuning fork symbol above it, signifying tuning fork. So you have both those features. Then the other thing about this watch that I find interesting is you turn it over and you look at this little hallmark here, if you can see that. It's a little J, and that means John L. Case Manufacturing Company. And this company was in West 46th Street, New York City. So the case was made in Manhattan. The watch movement was made in Queens.
Wow.
And
It's
just
never going to happen again.
no, I mean, it might. I think it might. And I think people are serious about this idea of locally made, locally grown, authenticity. And this is where it started. This is really the beginning of that. Things made right here, used by people, men who are craftsmen, building things, of beauty and of technology.
All right.
Want to talk about some other watches?
No, we're